Welcome back to the Faith Forward podcast. Jon Ackerman, and joined today by my good friend Mike Haynes.
Yeah,
Hi, Mike.
Glad to be here.
Thanks for being here. This is going to be fun. So if you've been tracking with us for a little bit, we are now done with the book of Colossians. 9 weeks on Jesus is greater, Jesus at the center, and what does that practically look like? Not just that it's theologically true, not just that it's objectively true, but how do we actually get that to be the reality of our life? Today, though, we're going to talk about Mike's message. It's Thursday. It's this coming Sunday, but you're watching this after Sunday, and time is weird. So this week is sort of a one-off. Mike's going to talk about reaching the next generation, which makes sense because you're the high school youth pastor. And at the same time, this isn't just the youth ministry message. So tell us a little bit about what you think you're going to say on Sunday, and then we'll dive into how do we bring this home for us.
Yeah, it's tough because, and this has been something that we've talked about in the youth ministry community, the fact that you don't really see a whole lot of youth ministry in the Bible. When Paul's writing letters to churches, he doesn't really talk about the youth ministry department or about what happens at youth group, because the cultural differences were such that, like, youth ministry is kind of an absurd concept in the first century. Delayed adolescence and all kinds of cultural differences have created a need that we have met, with the answer being youth ministry in American culture. But so for that reason, it's difficult to preach a message on youth ministry and because it's not in there. It's just a totally different world. But still, there is a whole lot. In fact, I would say most of the Bible is about reaching the next generation. I mean, that's what most of the Old Testament talks incredibly often about: generations, about how one person's actions, one person's wounds, one person's strongholds, although that language may not be used, affects the generations to come. That's so much of the Old Testament. And then in the New Testament, of course, part of Jesus' purpose in coming was to set up the church in what the church would be like for all generations to come. And so while this message is not about youth ministry and the X's and Y's of doing youth ministry well, it is about what's going on inside of each and every one of us that holds us back from effectively reaching the next generation.
Yeah. So this is going to be fun today. So I'm hoping that you're sticking around long enough to hear this. This isn't the youth ministry message, and this isn't you should come volunteer in youth ministry, though you should. You should. We'd love to have you. But this is, like you said, the gospel focus, God's focus has always been reaching the next generation, because there's always another generation coming. And the context is constantly changing. Right? The world that they live in, whatever the next generation happens to be. And as a student of history, you go back 6,000 years, 8,000 years, 10,000. Yeah, yes, the context that the subsequent generation experienced was often much more similar than we experience now, where even just the gap in years between us meant that our childhoods in some ways were wildly different, even though there were some significant similarities. And it feels like that pace just keeps getting faster and faster.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that I love that you brought out in your message this Sunday was what's often in the way of the next generation experiencing what God has for them. What's often in the way of the next generation being who God is calling them to be is what's inside of me. And you said when it comes to the next generation, if our response to them comes out of the overflow of our wounds, our brokenness, our insecurities, our voice with them will be silenced. And you took us to the beginning of Luke, which, as you said, was a strange place to find a youth ministry section of the scriptures.
It's a terrible choice.
But talking about this space in the priest Zechariah's story in the very first chapter of Luke as someone who has an encounter with God and who understands that God has a plan for a next generation, but has some serious questions based out of a life experience that says, I'm not really sure I'm buying this. And as a result, his voice gets literally silenced. And where we find ourselves in subsequent generations is that if we have the same sort of experience with God, where God is trying to indicate, here's what I'm doing in the next generation, and our response is, yeah, I don't know. Or I feel like, God, you've let me down before, or you've not done things the way that I thought you should before. I'm not buying it. I think we need to do it my way. You may not go mute for the duration of a pregnancy, but your voice with the next generation may be effectively silenced. So say a little bit more about what we're trying to avoid here with that.
Yeah, it's one of those things that we all kind of instinctively know. We've all been there before, or we've seen it in movies, TV shows. It's a pretty common trope that teenagers are resistant to listen to the wisdom of the older generations. This is an incredibly common trope. But I think that what has probably been misportrayed is this idea that teenagers they just don't listen to anybody. In my experience, that's not true. What is actually far more true is that teenagers don't listen to adults whom they perceive don't actually care about them. If you don't see me, don't understand me, don't really care about me, you only care about your thing, your values, but you're not willing to legitimize the things that I feel are important, then in that case, I won't listen to you. I don't want to hear anything that you have to say. Now, that's not to say that everything teenagers do should be validated, because there are some things that teenagers value that should be corrected. However, I just think that this is a really interesting passage. This passage is not about youth ministry. This passage is not about reaching the next generation in its original context. However, I think it is so fascinating, the parallels that we can draw between the fact that when it came to the next generation, Zechariah got exposed, some of his wounds and strongholds got exposed, and then as a result of that, his voice was silenced. And I just think that's true of us. I just think that that's incredibly true of us, that if you react to teenagers out of the overflow of your insecurities, fears, your disappointments in life, out of the overflow of the stuff that you have going on, and they sense that, then you are going to lose influence with them. And I just think that is a proverb of life. And so that is the purpose of this message, is to draw out that proverb of life and to call us to gospel-centered transformation for the sake of the next generation.
Yeah. So the weekly reminder, if you didn't watch the message, go back and watch the message. But if you're catching this, days, weeks, months later, because that's just how you consume the podcast side of this, where we want to go today is the practical. Some of this is for parents of children. Some of this is for people that are teaching, mentoring, coaching children in whatever capacity, in schools, in sports, in youth ministry, just in their neighborhood. But it's also the reality that this isn't just about kids today. This is about how do you effectively communicate with any generation that is different than yours? Because the same is going to hold true regardless. And so one of the things that I really like that your message was highlighting, Mike, that we have to come to terms with wherever we find ourselves, at whatever age and time and context we find ourselves, is that so much of what we attempt to do as parents, as coaches, as teachers, as mentors, as youth pastors, as whatever, is a reaction to what we experienced when we were young, either conscious or unconscious. And it's usually some version of, I either want to do it just like that because that really resonated with me, or I'm never going to be like that because that was the absolute worst and no one should ever be subjected to that. And I would say that there's potential truth and value on both ends of that. But notice how often we turn our experiences not just into a lens to consider as we move forward, but as the programmatic truth of what should happen going forward. So if it was a horrible experience, then we either consciously or unconsciously say things like, I'm never going to be like blank. That parent, that teacher, that coach, that youth pastor, that next door neighbor, that whatever. And the fundamental reality is that as human beings, we're often most comfortable with polar opposite swings.
Yep.
And so if we say, I'm never going to be like that person, we often jet 180 degrees in the opposite direction without giving it a thought, because the opposite must be better. And that's not actually true all the time. And just as true is if we were really moved, if we were really affected, if we were really motivated, encouraged, instructed by something or someone that was good, and we decide, I want to be exactly like that when I grow up. And I had a teacher like that. It was part of why I spent 16 years in public education. I had a teacher that made me go, I want to be just like that. The same isn't always exactly what's needed. And so one of the places that we have to find ourselves, and this won't come as a surprise to any of you that have listened to more than 2 episodes on this platform, this is the place where we have to begin to ask God, not only about how to influence the next generation, God, what's the right answer to connect with them? But some of this is, God, who do you say that I am? Who have you called me to be? Not just as a reaction to the negative influences or a model after the positive influences, but who am I supposed to be? And this can even come out of the really well-intentioned places like, the things that we felt like we didn't get when we were kids. I'm going to make sure my kids, whether that's biological, whether that's a mentee or whatever capacity you're engaging with kids. I never got this when I was a kid. I'm going to make sure these kids get. Like you said, some of the things that kids want aren't necessarily things that kids need. Mm-hmm. And so if we operate out of that reactionary lens as a default setting of I'm going to do the opposite of what was bad, I'm going to do the exact same of what was good, I'm going to give what I didn't get, in some ways we're just setting ourselves up to repeat the cycle in a new way. And so it seems like there's an invitation to offer something different to the next generation.
Yeah. And it's just so easy to do that, right? I mean, it's so human to do that. But ultimately what God is calling us toward, there's something that I'm going to use a metaphor that I just know nothing about. Okay. That's always fun to do.
That a lot here.
Okay, great. So, apparently there's this thing called a plumb line, you know what I mean? And that's about all I know about that. But you got the plumb line and it just hangs straight down. Right. And I think that, and then you use that to measure or something. I don't know what you do with it. But it's in construction, I'm pretty sure. And, you tell the people what a plumb line is.
Has to do with toilets, I think.
Yeah, so you get toilets and you got there's a plumb line, and that's why they call them plumbers. And so
we're gonna get some emails from
this. So you got the plumb line, right? And I think what a lot of us do is we use our own subjective experience as a plumb line, and what God is calling us toward, what the part of the purpose of the gospel of Jesus coming and making us into new creations, is that we would reset our plumb line, that the thing that we measure ourselves against, the thing that we try to make sure that we're straight up and down the way that we should be. It's not what we've experienced in the past. That's our old creation. And what we're called to is to instead, you are a brand new creation. I don't think we take that verse literally enough. We honestly kind of think that we're just an improved version of ourselves, but that's not what 2 Corinthians 5 says. This is you are a new creation. And so what I would encourage us to do is to, instead of setting our plumb line according to what we have experienced in the past, to set our plumb line to who God has revealed himself to be to us. And that becomes our new plumb line. That becomes our new standard against which we measure ourselves. And when we can do that, we may end up still doing some things the same, similarly, or completely different from what we experienced, but it's not going to come from our own subjective experiences as the foundation. It's going to come from, well, this is how God has treated me in the gospel, or this is what Jesus modeled for me. And so that's how I want to treat the next generation, not because of what I experienced, but because of what I am experiencing in Christ,
Yeah. Yeah. I'm really glad you made that point, because I wasn't thinking about that at all. And yet that's what we've spent the last 9 weeks talking about. The reality that you are a new creation because Jesus is at the center. And we don't take that literally enough. And yet that was what we focused on in particular the last 3 weeks, that because you are a new creation, you have a fundamentally different power source. You have a fundamentally different direction that your life gets to take. You are no longer stuck in either I have to do it the way that I saw it, or I have to swing to the opposite direction. Jesus is such a fan of the third way. And the third way isn't necessarily the middle way. It's just other than.
Yeah.
And so when we go back to some of the things that Paul was saying in Colossians that we were highlighting the last few weeks, because you are a new creation, because your real life is hidden in Christ, there's some things that not only should you no longer engage in, but they're no longer compatible with you. Sexual morality, impurity, lust, evil desires, greed, idolatry, anger, rage, malicious behavior, slander, dirty language, they don't have a place in you anymore. And so whether you experienced that, whether you were the recipient of that and you decided never again, or you decided, well, I guess this is just the thing that gets stuff done. I mean, it seemed like anger was pretty motivational for me when I was on the receiving end. And so I know that works. So that's how I'm going to engage in the next generation, because it gets results, man. The fear of God. Paul says there are some things that are no longer compatible with your new nature, and there are some things that are compatible. And those things that are compatible are things like, you got to find it in the notes. Paul, you write a lot of words.
So many words.
Clothe yourselves with tender-hearted mercy, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience. Make allowance for each other's faults. Forgive anyone who offends you. I mean, just stop right there for a second and think about just how applicable that is to dealing with a younger generation.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an instruction manual if ever I heard one. But again, that's not just things to do. That's who you're becoming. That is the most compatible thing within this new life. That's how you're wired to live. The Lord forgave you, so forgive anyone who offends you. Clothe yourself with love. The love that binds us together in perfect harmony. Let the peace that comes from Christ rule in your heart. That's part of what we get to offer, is putting on this new nature and learning to walk in it. That is one of the most effective ways to reach any subsequent generation, is for that generation to witness a transformation in you. Mm-hmm. That's part of what's so attractional, and that's part of what speaks to kids that you care about me and you see me, because they're looking at you.
Yep.
And they're seeing you. And when they see you react differently than what they're accustomed to, when they see you be intentional with them, when they see you be tender-hearted with them, rather than treat them like, oh, you're just some dumb kid of whatever age, the things that you care about don't matter. Let me tell you what matters. When they witness the effects of your new nature and the things that you're putting on, man, does that have an effect. Mm-hmm. Man, does that have an effect. And so one of the other things to be reminded of is that whatever you have experienced, God has purpose for. Doesn't mean he necessarily desired all of it, doesn't mean he intended all of it, but there is purpose for it. And sometimes what that means is that, not so much in a parenting role, but if you're in a coaching, mentoring, teaching, pastoral role, God's often going to bring you people in a one-on-one space mm-hmm. that specifically need your experiences, your background, your context, the things that you can be most empathetic towards, the things that you can be most understanding of. But man, does that get blown out of the water anytime you add another person to the room, let alone 20 or 30, yep. or add a child to the mix that is not a recreation of you, but is a blend of you and someone else. And you very quickly start to realize that one of the things that God is after in your new nature is not that you just perpetuate your old nature. It's like he's serious mm-hmm. about you're new, you're different. Mm-hmm. Be different, because this new you is going to have an effect that the old you couldn't. Mm-hmm. And so it's really interesting as you start to step into the space of engaging with a next generation, whether biological or influential or whatever the case is, that you start to realize there's parts of me that are really good and helpful right now. And there are some parts of me that are going to need to change. Yep. That are actually going to have a negative effect if they remain unchanged. Yep.
Yeah. And that's extremely difficult to come to terms with, because I think most of us like to believe that we have grown enough, right? That we did it. You can think back to the way that you were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the way that you were as a kid or a teenager. And you think, man, I've matured so much. I've grown so much. And you kind of go, didn't I do it? Like, haven't I done it? Like, goodness gracious, how is it possible that I still have so far to go? And because that is so difficult to do, we often end up, and you mentioned it with like the fear of God thing, you really can justify just about any behavior if you want to. Yeah. And we say that all the time in American Christendom. You can justify just about anything. If you know enough scripture and you're willing to twist it to fit your own agenda, you can justify just about anything. And so, because we're capable of doing that, and because we're incentivized to do that as human beings who are sick and tired of having to grow, we end up like calling pieces of ourselves, this is who I am, when in reality, it's just something that God hasn't dealt with yet. This is a piece of me that God hasn't dealt with yet. It's a part of me that's still my old creation, but we try to twist it and we try to justify it. No, this is part of the new creation. It's kind of the idea, there's some truth to this, and that's what makes it so tricky. There's some truth to the fact that, some people are hammers and some people are whatever the opposite of a hammer is.
Plumb lines.
A plumb line. You've got two types of people in this world. You've got hammers and you've got plumb lines. And the hammers, want to believe, a hammer might want to believe like, no, this God created me to be a hammer. And there might be some truth to that, right? We talk about temperaments around here all the time. Some of us are red, some of us are green, some of us are blue, some of us are yellow. And there's beauty to that. There is God created beauty to that. But it is also the case that there is some stuff within us that we ought to let go of if we're going to reach the next generation effectively. And we're not willing to let go of it because we're just too busy justifying it.
Yeah. By the way, this is a good time if you have questions, you can email us at faithforward@cfcwired.org. Please do not email us and try to correct our understanding of tools. One of the things you may not know about Mike and I is we have a long history, and when we get together, we like to have fun. So we understand our tools. We're just having a good time here. Don't let that distract you. I've missed doing this with you.
Oh, man.
So part of where we're taking this conversation now, actually, I would say the main thrust of the next part of this conversation is that a large portion of reaching the next generation effectively has to do with our ongoing transformation. Mm-hmm. And I think so often, if we don't think about it intentionally, one of the things that we become convinced of is that we are supposed to make the next generation become like us. Mm-hmm. That would be success for them, and that would be success for me, is if the next generation becomes like me. And again, there's a little truth seed here, because part of what the word discipleship means is becoming like the one who disciples you. The challenge is that when we forget, we are discipling people to become like Jesus, not become like ourselves. We are discipled to become like Jesus. We disciple people to become like Jesus, not to become like me. And so one of the things that means is that we have to continue to discover who we truly are, and then not even try to make people become like the more true version of me, but continually point people to the God who knows who they are. And so another one of the things that you're probably going to say on Sunday, you said, you've got lots of opinions about the next generation, and that's great. Aren't you curious what the God of all generations has to say about the next one? And I thought there was something really beautiful and poignant in that. Of so often I default to, especially when working with a younger generation, I default to, well, I know what they need. I know what they need because I once was them and because I no longer am them. And so I know what they need. And I thought this was such a great invitation to a place of humility and of reflection, of this isn't about making them like me. This is about helping them become who God says they need to be. And if that's not something we are consciously paying attention to, it's going to be real easy for our prayers for the next generation to be some version of, God, can you get them to stop doing the things that don't make sense to me and that I don't like, and make them more like me?
Yeah.
And we're going to miss out on what the God of all generations has to say about them.
Yeah. And I have a really good example of this because, well, first of all, I just want to acknowledge something that we all believe is true. And that's that whatever generation you are, you believe that that's the best generation to ever exist on planet Earth. Yeah. And so we're millennials. We are kind of like the ends of that spectrum, but we're both millennials. I genuinely, this is not a bit, I genuinely believe that we are better than every other generation.
I refuse to identify with that label, by the way.
Of a millennial?
Technically on the cusp, but I recognize the previous generation is greater. So you can believe what you want to
feel
believe.
A little Gen X-y?
A little bit.
Okay. Yeah. Well, you're an old soul, so that's
true.
Yeah.
That's true. Anyway, carry on.
No, well, so because of that, when we look at the next generation, it's super easy to see all of the ways that, here's what I guess what I'm trying to get at. There are there are some things that every generation needs to pour into the younger generation. It needs to correct because children need correction. The next generation needs correction. They need to be guided on their way. Otherwise, kids are raising themselves. Yes. So there are these things that all kids need to be corrected in them by the older generation. But at the same time, every generation, and this is increasingly true with the evolution of technology, every generation is also going to have some ways that they are just going to function totally differently than the generations before them, and they need to. If they don't function totally different than the generation before them, then they will not be able to function well and succeed in the world that they're going to step into as adults. Let me give you a really good example. And the difficulty is it's very difficult for the older generations to differentiate between what is a generational trait that is valuable and important for the next generation and what is a trait that's just kids being punk kids and it needs to be right. Gently, graciously corrected. So let me give you an example of this. A couple of days ago, I was talking with a high school student and I was helping them with some homework that they were working on a school project. And I'd come over to the house so that I could help them out with that a little bit. That's just, I didn't sign up for that as a youth pastor, but it happens occasionally. And so I'm helping them in a project that I have absolutely no proficiency in whatsoever, but I'm an adult. And so sometimes as an adult, you're able to help kids do stuff. And so, they're talking about this project. I need sources for this. And, what do you think, how you think I could find sources? And, kind of poking around. It's kind of this abstract, topic that they have to do their project on. And so they say to me, they go, you know what? I'm just gonna AI it when I get home. I'm just gonna AI it. And the alarm bells. You can't do that. That's cheating.
The apocalypse is here.
You cannot do. Now, granted, I use AI all the time as an adult, but I'm not in school, right. So it feels different. All the alarm bells. You can't do that. I'm not advocating for you to do that. I'm not going to stop you, but I am telling you, like an integrity move, don't use AI. That's cheating. You need to go find sources the old-fashioned way, Google, the way the good Lord intended, right? And they go, it's not cheating. We're allowed to use AI. It just is a much more efficient way of finding what we need to find. And I'm like, man, you're right. And it's this generational difference of, man, when I was growing up, we didn't go to the library. That's stupid. But I grew up in the .com boom, and so listen, by the time I'm in middle school, no one goes to the library anymore. You use Google. I'm sure there were some older people who were like, you need to go to the library like the good Lord intended. That's right. That's lazy. The next generation is lazy, which is what my generation has been called, is lazy. Millennials are lazy. But man, if we had never figured out how to use the internet, we would be screwed with the way that the world works today. Right? And so there are things that are generational traits that are valuable, and there are also things that we ought to absolutely correct. And so yes, when we talk with the next generation, we need to make sure that we are not trying to turn them into us, but that we are turning them into the Jesus-loving, Jesus-following version of them.
To be clear, before I say anything else, when you were talking about as the good Lord intended, I immediately went to libraries and card catalogs.
As the good Lord intended.
As the good Lord
That's what
intended.
the good Lord intended.
That's what a decade will do, man.
Yep.
That's what a decade will do.
Same generation, totally different experience.
Yep. One of the things that I'm really struck by, and I didn't think of this until after I'd put these notes together and I was sitting here this morning waiting for us to start recording, is what God shows Zechariah, going back to the section in Luke that you referenced, what God showed Zechariah about his coming son, right? This kid, John, that's on his way, the next generation that Zechariah is going to have the most influence on. And God says some things to Zechariah after they've had words about how little Zechariah is going to be speaking for a bit, about who this son is. What he's going to be like. And what's so interesting for me in that context is that what the angel Gabriel is describing to Zechariah about this coming child is that this coming child is going to be nothing like Zechariah. Mm-hmm. In an age where what your father did is what you did as a son. And especially for who Zechariah is, a priest in the line of Aaron, his kid, whoever his kid would be, is set up for the life of a priest, serving in God's temple. And yet what the angel Gabriel is telling Zechariah is, that's not who your kid is. Your kid is something different. And this is a good thing. This is a good thing. Who your son is, and by the way, this is going to bring you great joy and gladness, because he's going to be great in the eyes of the Lord. And he should never touch wine or other alcoholic drinks. He's going to be filled with the Holy Spirit. He's going to turn many Israelites to the Lord their God. He'll be a man with the spirit and power of Elijah the prophet. He will prepare the people for the coming of the Lord. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children. He will cause those who are rebellious to accept the wisdom of the godly. And I have to imagine that as Zechariah is hearing like impossibility after impossibility after impossibility come out of Gabriel's mouth, of course he responds with, can I get a fact check on this?
Mm-hmm.
But here's what I love about this. Zechariah gets silenced. And you had mentioned at the beginning that if we don't deal with the overflow of our wounds and brokenness and insecurities, our voice with the next generation will be silenced. Isaiah gets silenced, but he doesn't waste the time.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason we know that is because when John is born and Zechariah's wife Elizabeth says his name's going to be John, and all the relatives are like, dude, nobody in your family is named John. You can't do that. Stop trying to make your husband. And they're like, Zechariah, what's his name? And he writes out John, and immediately he can speak. And that's not just the miracle for me. The miracle is what he speaks. It's labeled as Zechariah's prophecy in your Bible when you look at this section. And he starts off by praising God, by praising the God of Israel, who has done and continues to do the impossible for his people. But as you get down to verse 76, he shifts the focus of his praise and his prayer and his prophecy to his son John. And he says this in verse 76. He says, "And you, my little son, will be called the prophet of the Most High, because you will prepare the way for the Lord. You will tell his people how to find salvation through the forgiveness of their sins." And you skip a couple verses down as Zechariah finishes his prayer. And verse 80, the last verse in the first chapter says, "And John grew up and became strong in the Spirit, and he lived in the wilderness until he began his public ministry." There is nothing in John's life that looks like what it should have looked like in that culture and context, given who his father is. And his father, from the moment of John's birth, calls out the truth of who he knows John is supposed to be, not the truth of who he'd like him to be. And I don't know, because the text doesn't say. And so maybe there was some backsliding at times, but it doesn't seem like it. It doesn't seem like there was ever a day where Zechariah, as John's, 7, 8, 10, 12, like, hey, you know what? Just in case this prophet thing doesn't work out, because, sometimes God goes quiet for a while. Maybe I should show you some stuff in the temple.
Yeah.
You know what? Maybe, your mother and I are getting old. Social Security is not a thing yet. Maybe you actually want to think about stepping into a trade that might be a little profitable. It doesn't seem like that was the case. It seems like Zechariah was crystal clear on who his next generation was supposed to be, and he called it out, and he allowed God to make John who John was supposed to be, not who Zechariah thought John was supposed to be.
Yeah, that is so deeply powerful and so greatly convicting if you're a parent in the room, right? And you have a kid who is just super different from you. It's so convicting, but it's so good, and it's so important that we recognize that the next generation, that this is not only true of John specifically, but this is again, I see Luke 1 as being a proverb for us when it comes to interacting with the next generation, that there are traits inherent, and then I've said this before at CFC, there are traits inherent in the next generation that are going to be a wild contrast from the traits inherent in your generation and the values inherent in your generation. And some of those things need to be not only celebrated, but supported and encouraged, and fan the flames on that, even though there's some parts of it that make you a little bit uncomfortable. I have to imagine that for a priest, a Levitical priest, I have to imagine that some of what John did when he was older, he's wearing these clothes that are pretty weird. His diet is a little strange, he's yelling at people out in the wilderness. Priests are these very buttoned up, well respected. You don't catch a priest on a bad day, right? The priests are always have it together. John does not strike me as somebody who appeared to have it all together. He did. Everything was intentional, but he just seemed like he was really out there. And I think that for a lot of us as parents, as coaches, as teachers, as volunteers, sometimes we run into a kid or we just take notice of the next generation and it feels like there's some stuff about them that's a little wild and it really needs to be tamed. And the reason that we need to ask God about what he wants to do in the next generation is because that is perhaps our best way of determining, is this wildness, is this trait in the next generation something that I need to help guide, or is it something that is God ordained? The only reason that Zechariah didn't freak out, I would imagine, is because he had a direct conversation with the angel of the Lord. That is the only thing. If that conversation had not happened, but they still had a kid and their kid turned out to be John, I would imagine there'd have been some friction.
Oh, yeah.
There had been a little bit of friction there. But because Zechariah and God had a conversation about the next generation, that's what clued Zechariah in to not freak out when his son was born like a hammer, and not a plumb line.
Right. Way to bring it back. And so this is part of the invitation for you as the older generation of whatever younger generations you have influence with, is to spend time praying, not just for who you think they should be, but asking God for who he says they are. And that may take some practice, and that may bring up some uncomfortable places. And this is not to say, well, just let whatever random stuff they're doing, let it ride because maybe it's God. No. Go and ask. Go and inquire of the Lord. Lord, what about them are you calling out? And what about them does need discipline? What about them does need to be pruned? And again, I keep thinking more about the reality of the life of Zechariah and Elizabeth as their son John grew up. Mm-hmm. And like you said, as a Levitical priest, pretty buttoned up, significant in society, and here's his kid running wild in the wilderness.
Yeah.
And the effect that must have had on their social standing.
Yep.
There's clearly a group of people that are gathered around at John's birth that understand from Zechariah's own mouth, having been silenced for the duration of the pregnancy, to now hear these words pour forth. And I'm sure they experienced in a way that for most of them, if not all of them, felt like confirmation of this is what God's saying. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole lot of other folks, the folks that moved into town, the folks that weren't there for that moment, or the folks that are just still uncomfortable with their own stuff and are watching what looks like a little hellion running around in weird clothes, eating weird stuff, mm-hmm. more weird than what kids usually put in their mouths. Mm-hmm. And you're just okay with this as his parents? Yeah. You're just going to allow this?
Yeah.
And to have the conviction as the older generation of knowing this is who he's supposed to be. And so not only will I allow it, I will encourage it. I will advocate for it. I will protect it. I will defend it. I will stand in the way of anyone else who tries to tell him he's supposed to be something other than. Mm-hmm. We often think that the primary role of parents, teachers, coaches, mentors, youth pastors is to impart skills and knowledge and know-how.
Yep.
And while those are important, the primary role of parents, teachers, coaches, pastors, mentors, whatever, is to impart a deep, abiding, and authentic sense of identity. And then to impart the skills and know-how that will allow that person to flourish in that identity. That is what the older generation is called to, is to put their wisdom to use in discerning what God is up to, not what they think God should be up to. Mm-hmm. And so be curious about what God might be up to with an individual or frankly with an entire generation, rather than be certain that we know what God is not up to. because our frustration with what we think they should not be doing will get in the way. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be frustrated. Doesn't mean we might not even have a reason to be frustrated. But are we clear on what God is doing?
Yeah.
And we saw this again, not just in the life of Zechariah, but even with the disciples and Jesus. The disciples were crystal clear on who the Messiah was supposed to be. And so once they got over the shock value of it's finally happened, he's here, they then hit frustration point after frustration point after frustration point, when it seemed like the Messiah was constantly veering away from the spotlight, was constantly drawing crowds and then leaving the crowds in the dust.
Yep.
Seemed to have no interest whatsoever in overthrowing the government, even though the government was supposed to rest on his shoulders.
Yep.
But Jesus was crystal clear on who he was because his Father had told him.
Yeah.
Let us be that for the next generation. Let us be the ones who are advocating for who God says they are, not just who we or those around them think, well, this is who you should be. This is what makes the most sense. Mm-hmm. And again, that brings us full circle back to this means we need to invite the Holy Spirit to uncover and help heal our own stuff, because working with the next generation is going to expose some stuff.
Yep. Yeah. 100%. 100%. In order to be curious about what God is going to do, it's going to require us to let go of some strongholds, is essentially what we're talking about. Like control, for instance, is a reason that many of us have a hard time with this. It's because and some of it is control, some of it's probably insecurity too, because I think most of us want to believe that we've done life the right way. And we have some evidence to support that. And most of us have some evidence to contradict that. But at the end of the day, we are wanting to believe that we have done life well. And so when you've got the next generation going about life differently, it flares up. Like we said, you start hanging out with the next generation, you start paying attention, you start interacting with them. It's gonna bring some stuff to light. It starts flaring up that insecurity, that undealt with wound that maybe was rooted in childhood or maybe is young adult years, whatever it was. And so that's the reason why it's so important to deal with that stuff, to diagnose and allow God to start to heal that stuff. Because if you don't, then when the next generation does what God has called them to do, you're going to be left feeling insecure instead of encouraged by how God's people are changing and molding and prioritizing different things. Again, we all would like to believe that the thing that we've prioritized within Christendom in our generation was objectively the most important thing. And we would all like to believe that. We got a volunteer who's, in his 60s, and when he talks about the Jesus movement and kind of the more hippie style following Jesus kind of thing that he was part of when he was a young adult, I really am amazed by the difference in the way that they expressed their faith and lived out their faith versus the way that I do today. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of similarities, but there are some real differences. And it is just, I've just come to believe that while none of us is doing it perfectly, and that every generation catches hold of something really beautiful and important in the gospel and champions that for a generation or two. And that there's something very human, but there's also something very godly about that. But in order for us to see through that lens, it's going to require us to deal with our own insecurity about, well, did I do good? Did I do it right? Did I do good? Please, someone tell me that I did good. Hey, kids, tell me that I did good. Am I doing good? And if you constantly have that need for external affirmation and validation that you're doing life well, then yeah, it's going to be a threat to you when the next generation comes along and they insist on doing it a little bit differently.
And part of what happens as we heal, I know this is the desire not only of every parent, but of every teacher, every coach, every mentor, every youth pastor, is I not only want to be helpful in guiding and directing the next generation, but I want to help them avoid the pain and the hurt that I experienced.
Sure.
I mean, many times that feels like mission number one.
Yeah.
And I think we all instinctively understand this, but the more that we can be honest about the reality, it is not possible to prevent the next generation from experiencing some of the pain and hurt that you experienced. It is not possible. Jesus said, you have an enemy. And that enemy is the same enemy for the next generation as it was for yours, as it was for the generation that came before, and as it will be for the generations that come after for however long that lasts. Often our attempts to prevent hurt and harm and pain in the next generation is incredibly well-intentioned, is incredibly noble, and will sometimes keep them from becoming who God says they are. Again, I think about Zechariah again and Elizabeth as mom and dad to a kid who is so very clearly living out who God says he is, and the ridicule that kid must have faced, to say nothing of his parents. But what his parents knew their kid was hearing from people that thought he was just off his rocker, that thought he needed to be reined in, that would tell John how much he was disgracing his family legacy, that he needed to shape up, sit up, act right, change his clothes, cut his hair, and eat like a normal kid. And the pain that must have caused not only Zechariah and Elizabeth as his parents, but that they knew must have been affecting their child. Because however clear we are on God's call for our life and God's description of our identity, stuff hurts. I mean, that's part of why we recognize the value of Jesus' humanity. Jesus himself said that he knew what it was to experience rejection and betrayal and heartache and being misunderstood. And so it must have been the same for John. And so it must have been the same for his parents. And if Zechariah and Elizabeth's goal was to minimize John's suffering, well, let's just keep him away from people. Where John was supposed to be was right in front of people. And learning to navigate the reactions that people would have to him so that he could be even more effective with the people that he was supposed to be in front of. You cannot 100% prevent your child from being hurt.
Yep.
But you can 100% show your child how to heal, how to connect to the God who heals when they have been hurt, particularly as they begin to live out the truth of who God says they are. Because as they live out the truth of who God says they are, they have an enemy who comes to steal, kill, and destroy. And we cannot lead the next generation where we ourselves have not gone. We cannot point them to something that we have not experienced for ourselves with any degree of authenticity. And so let that be maybe one of your first steps in learning to reach and influence the next generation, is learn to be someone that God can lead. Learn to be someone that God has healed. Learn to be someone that God has spoken with clarity, a sense of who I am and who he says I am, uniquely and specifically, so that I can then say to those who come behind me, I may not know exactly who you are, but I know how to connect you with the one who does.
Yeah. If we can do that, and for some of us that probably feels like a big if, but if we could do that, I think what we'll discover is the same joy that many parents get to discover when they see their kid do something that they're deeply impressed by because they're not capable of doing it. And I think all of us want to be that kind of parent. We want to be that kind of coach. We want to be that kind of mentor. We want to be that kind of volunteer. But we can't do that if we're coming at things from a place of reaction, if we're trying to only use our context to inform the way that we parent, coach, mentor, teach. It's going to require, and I hate to talk about plumb lines again, but it's going to require that we establish a new plumb line, and that plumb line is how God has treated us in the context of the gospel. If we can do that, the next generation, well, I won't say the next generation will be fine, because the next generation will be fine whether we do that or not.
Amen to that.
But if we can do that, then the next generation will be fine, and we'll get to play a really cool part in seeing it happen.
Yeah. So friends, as always, the hope has been that this is helpful. Perhaps a tad uncomfortable, but helpful. And so Mike, as always, thanks for being here.
Yeah.
This is fun.
Absolutely.
Thanks for letting us, as I so often say, thanks for letting us be a part of your journey. And thank you for choosing to be a part of ours, because we are still very much in process as well. So on behalf of Mike, I'm Jon. We'll see you all next time, and invest in plumb lines. It's going to be a thing.